is this Sony's cheapest cinema camera. Coming in at under $1,000, this thing is so incredibly cheap, but it's got the exact same sensor as one of the Sony cinema line cameras. This is the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II. As someone who shoots on the full frame cameras like FX6, FX3 for example, the ZV-E10 Mark II never really tickled my fancy. It's clearly aimed at the more creator space and the more vlogging, on-the-go content creation space. So it never really crossed my mind. But I recently went to Madeira for the Sony Kando Trip UK, and I was actually lucky enough to loan this camera for about 3 days and also loan it to make this video. Because when I found out it's got the exact same sensor as the Sony FX30, I was thinking, how is it even possible that this costs under $1,000, mate? So when I was in Madeira, I wanted to put this thing to the test and see if it was any good and test out that 4K 10-bit image with all of them 15 stops of dynamic range and see if this thing really could be Sony's cheapest cinema camera. Now, clearly being that E-mount across obviously all of Sony's cameras, I could fit full frame lenses on there like my 24-70, my 16-35, and all of my little prime lenses like the 50mm, the 85 and whatnot, but we've obviously got an APS-C size sensor. Now, that made me think, right, APS-C, I could definitely try out my anamorphic lenses on this thing on this trip. And that's exactly what I've done. I took my Laowa Nanomorph anamorphic lenses. A lot of Sony cameras recently have been adding that D-squeeze feature inside their cameras. So clearly they want people to start shooting anamorphic. But the thing is, most affordable anamorphic lenses are APS-C or Super 35. That's where the FX30 and the ZV-E10 Mark II come in. But sadly, the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II doesn't have the D-squeeze feature like the other cinema line cameras. If this thing really is going to be used as a cinema camera, you're more than likely going to want to rig it up. Obviously, the FX30 has got rigging mounts all over the camera, but you can simply get a 40 quid cage for this thing, and you've got all the mounts that you could possibly need. And if you're going to rig this up with a cage, you're more than likely going to put a handle and probably a monitor on there. And then all you've got to do is de-squeeze your image through your monitor. Granted, we have only got the tiny micro HDMI port, but you still get that exact same feed as if you had that full-size HDMI. So on the ZV-E10 Mark II, we can shoot up to 4K 60 in 10-bit, which isn't quite as much as the FX30, but not many people are really shooting 4K 120 these days, and that doesn't mean that it's a cinema camera. What really makes one of these classed as a cinema camera? It's quite hard to tell these days. The fact that it's got 4K 60 in 10-bit with 15 stops of dynamic range, a dual base ISO of 800 and 2500, the exact same codecs as all of the cinema line from Sony, it's hard to differentiate how this sensor isn't as good as the Sony cinema line FX30. Now, what about the in-body image stabilization like the FX30? Now, in my opinion, in-body image stabilization doesn't make a shot look more cinematic. It's a great video feature. Let's say you're shooting like a wedding or you're shooting something that you want to be really slow, really still. But some of the best cinema cameras in the world, literally the best ones in the world, they don't have in-body image stabilization, and that natural, beautiful handheld movement is what gives it that cinematic characteristic. Turning off your in-body image stabilization, for me, just gives your shot such a more dynamic and cinematic look, in my opinion. But as a general rule, the heavier your camera setup, the better your footage is going to look. So I definitely recommend rigging up that camera a little bit heavier, because it is definitely going to perform a lot better, especially in handheld. 99% of high-end cinema cameras are Super 35 sensors without ibis. This thing seems to tick every single box for what is considered these days a cinema camera. Now, when I was shooting with this thing in Madeira, them Kando trips are really just about connecting with other creators and other friends that you've got in the industry, and also trying out some amazing new kit. And I'm so incredibly grateful to even be invited on a trip like that. Obviously, someone that's been using Sony cameras for so long, to actually have the brand recognise you for what you do and obviously bring you on board to try out some new cameras in a really cool environment with a load of other creators is kind of like the dream really for someone like me. But the main focus of that trip for me was testing out this ZV-E10 Mark II to really see if this thing really is a cinema camera in a consumer camera's body, because that is exactly what I think this thing is. All of the shots that I got on this camera with both my Sony lenses and also my Anamorphic lenses, without a doubt stand up to the FX30 in my opinion. And image-wise, the only real difference between this and say the FX3 or one of the full frame Sony cameras is a slightly less amount of bokeh and obviously not as great low light. But all the biggest cinema cameras in the world have a Super 35 sensor, so why can this thing not be classed as a cinema camera? Oh yeah, and it has got a tally light. I just thought about the specs of this thing and thought I've just got to go and try it to really see if it does stand up to the FX30 and just see if this thing really is a Sony cinema camera for under $1,000. I think it might well be. Now the obvious thing for this one, mate, is overheating. This thing really can't run for very long in the heat. I refer you to Gerald Undun's impeccable overheating tests, but if a lot of your shots are quick, fast, snappy shots up to 10, 15, 20 minutes in the heat, then this thing could be a cinema camera to you. I'd actually go as far as saying this thing is more of a cinema camera than it is a video camera. In cinema, takes are really short, mate. In video, we're shooting long ass videos, mate. So the ZV-E10 Mark II is going to be way more suited to shoot in shorter cinematic takes rather than long continuous videos. Let me know in the comments if you lot think this isn't a cinema camera and you think I'm just an absolute nut job. I'm always open to being one of those, but I try my best not to, do you know what I mean? And as always, mate, thank you so much for watching this video, and thanks to Sony for allowing me to loan this little bad boy for a few days to make this video. And I'll be catching you lot in the next one, mate. Bosh.